So, welcome to Politics in Video Games, and just in case there's, I was scanning through the crowd now, it seems everybody's here is pretty old. There is profanity, racist concepts as evidence, not me being racist or anything, especially compared to BioShock Infinite. Just a caveat, so in case there's any concerns. Don't sue me, don't sue MAGFest. MAGFest is awesome. Okay, so the way I envision it, I'm just going to start with like a general overview, because this is meant, in case you didn't hear me earlier, politics in gaming, both as a way to encourage people to talk about it in the real world, but also real world examples. So I have the content, but I also want to hear from you. So let's start with the general part, and it should work. Let's hope it does.
All right. It works.
Yeah. I've come to the conclusion that politics are too serious a matter to be left to the politicians, and I enjoy that one specifically.
I'm very frightened by the fact that it was by a general.
And because I never actually codified this as an actual panel, and then you kind of do it on the seat of your pants, and actually it worked pretty well. Because I always like to do titles based on Dr. Strangelove, hugely political movie, so I was trying to think of a good title, and so I ultimately came up with this. If you break down poly, that means many, and ticks are blood-sucking insects, and think of it when they aren't just the enemies who are trying to get you in video games, but the concepts, be it in Call of Duty, or BioShock, or anything like that. And, oh yeah, I know what the next thing is. That refers to BioShock Infinite specifically. Oh, spoilers, obviously, in case, but I imagine at this point everybody's played it.
Played it, beat it.
Yeah. One of the things I liked about that game was, it very much kept the fundamental problem I have with the whole BioShock universe. I can't help but feel, because of the logic of video games, that it would have been a better game if it hadn't been a first-person shooter. Because of peripheral vision, inability to see around you and stuff like that. Kind of and it's not unprecedented, because if you look back into Bungie's history, Halo was originally supposed to be an RTS, things like that, so Resident Evil 1.5, it'd really be cool if there was an alternate version, or someone made an indie version of it or something where it was I don't know, to me I think it would work best as an RPG, or maybe, I don't know, but supposedly Ken Levine even said, I can't find a source on that quote, but he claimed, someone probably claimed that it was philosophy for the jocks or something like that, I don't know, but anyway, it appealed to me especially, and I never got around to playing it right away, but when I finally did, specifically for this, rushing through it, and the promise of the historical angles, it's really unfortunate because at best it waxes racism, philosophy, and everything else, and it left me unfulfilled, especially when it comes to the concepts of nativism, the idea of Zachary Hale Comstock, and many other ones, but quickly, probably because of the nature of video games and gaming logic, it seems to almost forget that. It's kind of profit, racist, that's enough. But they could have done so much more with it, even if it was implied as a lesson. And I'm going on and on, so I think the obvious way to instead of explaining exactly how I feel that it would have been better, the obvious way is, because it does go back to, even though it takes place, first mentioned around 1890, they do make references to how he feels about Abraham Lincoln, calling him the great apostate and everything. So I thought, this gels nicely with the clip, and I thought, not to the point of antagonism, but I thought the game would have been so much better if he had turned out to be like this character. And hopefully, and this is Gangs in New York. This guy is a crazy nativist.
What's he saying, boy? He was making his peace with God. The hell with that. He makes his peace with me. I'm hearing confession tonight, you mother-whoring Irish nigger. Whose man are you? We speak English in this country. Whose man are you? You see this knife? I'm going to teach you to speak English with this fucking knife. Whose man are you? Whose man are you?
Do you hear Comstock in that guy, except a little bit more vocal? And the portrayal, and everyone knows Daniel Day-Lewis is such a great actor, but when I read about the idea of Comstock, I really thought it would be like that, because even if you put it in the gaming logic narrative, I think having a villain who was more in your face, when you first see him on the airship, and I thought he was going to be present throughout the game, really harassing you, and I think, hearing more of his philosophy, and that's just a what if, but does anybody agree with me that he could have been more front and forward, and it probably would have made the game narratively better. Like if he actually believed in beyond, you know, like say racism, learning moment, or something like that. Nativism, learning moment, but not elaborating.
Well, I think that a lot of the problem with that game is what we often see in games where they used a lot of both political and sort of social topics as shock moments or as simple touchstones rather than diving into any of them, right? We saw all these things. Do you guys all remember the moment at the very beginning where they're dealing with, I mean, just straight up racism, right? Mm-hmm. And then we never get back to it.
Yeah.
And we just say, hey, racism, probably bad. And then we go on, right? And that's how
Exactly, yeah. That, the opening scene even sets it up well, and then they just kind of like, oh, first-person shooter gameplay.
Goes nowhere.
Over here.
I think thinking back on it, actually, now that you guys have mentioned it, you kind of just triggered my memories of the game. I enjoyed.
Oh, just a second. By the way, was the volume any good on that? Because I think I can make it louder, but
It was alright.
That's okay.
yeah.
For people in the front row, apparently it was all right. For everyone in the back, did you hear anything from that clip?
Yeah.
All right, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
So,
go on.
So thinking back on it, like I just can't. Besides the ending, I just don't really know what it was trying to tell me. Like I went through the game. Like I remember a lot of it. I remember the frustration of shooting some of the shooting sections, and I did pick it down or put it down and pick it up a few times when I was playing through it. But now that I'm like thinking about it, I'm just like, was there anything like there?
So, I just want to get us, I don't want to dive too far into the weeds and have this all be a Bioshock Infinite panel.
No.
I think you're correct, right? I think what happened was they had a number of different teams. From a development perspective, I'm pretty sure they had a number of different teams working on different sections of the game. And then all of a sudden somebody goes, oh crap, we have to ship, right? And they just grab whatever sections each team has finished, which are totally disjointed sections of the game, and hook them together. And that's why we get all these little segments. That's why we see it mechanically, right? Do you guys all remember the code books or whatever secret language stuff and the treasure chests? And you almost never see those, right? Remember that point where you go through that whole section to get the electrical thing which can turn on the funicular and you use it once? Right? I think this is evidence of the fact that really what happened is they had things which were way out of scope, they had way too many ideas, and it was just unfocused unlike the first Bioshock. And then when it came time, they realized we're running out of budget, we just have to string it all together.
There's a reason why Irrational doesn't exist anymore.
Yes.
Yeah, because I mean, arguably with the game, it could have honestly functioned as almost a visual novel style. Like it didn't necessarily need like the running shooting part. Because the plot alone didn't really work with it. That would have been good enough.
Well, and if we all look back to the first Bioshock, right? In the first Bioshock, the running and shooting worked because when you're talking about the philosophy of Ayn Rand, you're talking about this or Nietzsche will to power stuff. You're talking about an individual conquering by their own, and it shows us all the flaws in them. But you have to be this individual who doesn't care, who shoots anything in his way, who by himself does whatever he wants in this society, right? That makes a ton of sense for a first Bioshock.
It could have been a teachable moment overall, Infinite, and I still will try my best to bring it out, but when you fail to have examples in the game, it's harder to broach the topic with. But it's down a side hallway, you know, and it's fairly early in the game when you see they're all dressed like dandies, the boy and his mother kind of, and he goes like, I don't want you associating with that horrible Moira McTaggart or whatever her name is, and that is the clear Irish, anti-Irish, because of the Catholic angle that clip was trying to convey, but that's down the path, and then it just abandons it, which is too bad. But go on over there.
Me?
Yeah, sure.
You know, the problem with that, you know, Bioshock, all those games, because again, they seem to think that, okay, gameplay is important, but it also has to tie with the narrative, which sadly, with like big budget games, you're not going to have that. I mean, with politics and all these other type of things, you need to have something with a message. You have to be really speaking from it. But Bioshock Infinite, which I did still enjoy, it didn't really capture to me what Bioshock, the first one, really had, because it didn't really just, like you said, in terms of the game, it had some shock, this. I'm like, nothing. It's shock, but at the end of the day, it means nothing. It does is, it's trying that old Shakespeare quote, it's like a tale told by an idiot. It is with sound and fury, signifying nothing.
So one thing to toss into that is I just thinking about games that are shipped, because a lot of times games are shipped on very early. Like I've done that before too. You just run at a budget. Well, I'm just thinking about what games were shipped early and implied things and implied different types of politics that might not have intended, but because they're like, oh shoot, we need to get this out the door, and now this juxtaposition looks really bad. What was that zombie game that a number of years ago?
Was it Dead Island?
Dead Island, yeah. That got a lot of flack for that.
Well, my favorite is always Call of Juarez. Oh my god. Same deal.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we don't have to go into Call of Juarez. If you ever want an example, though, us butchering any attempt at understanding the modern world or politics, Call of Juarez. Excellent.
Great video.
Did all of you guys get to play Papers, Please, though? Because I thought that was an excellent
that's great,
example
yeah.
combining the two.
I like that. Yeah. And I was going to close with one other point on Bioshock, but you first on Bioshock?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, Bioshock Infinite treats politics like set dressing.
Right.
Yeah.
There's putting in there. I think a lot of games, if not almost all games except for maybe Papers, Please, use politics as like just part of, just as something to add in there for flavor. Not really ever addressing the issue in any real way. Like in Bioshock Infinite, they address racism in maybe a handful of scenes, maybe, but never really have anything meaningful to say. Or while Papers, Please, the racism that they convey in that game is amazing. Well, not amazing the racism, but amazing the way they do it.
Just like me.
Right. So like in Papers, Please,
Racism
right?
is amazing.
In Papers, Please, you get a letter, right? And the letter will be like, well, we just got bombed by this, country that doesn't exist, or this mythical country. And now you have to screen everyone out of that country. You need to get an extra screening. Otherwise, you're not going to be your family because we're going to fire you, right? So the racism there is institutional, right? And it's like being pushed down upon you. And even as a player, I'm forced. I myself, wherever this fictional country is, I'm putting them on special treatment, right? I'm checking them twice because maybe they are the person that's going to make the bomb go off, And that makes me feel horrible. I'm like sitting there being like, holy crap, I'm being racist right now. The game is forcing me into a position because of institutional racism and making me actually have to think about racism in a real and nuanced way.
Well, and I love the fact that it's a game mechanically that's entirely about following the rules to teach you when to break the rules, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. Because you don't have to.
Right, and there are cases, right? Remember that one moment where a man comes up and he comes into your booth and you're talking a little bit, checking his thing, and his stuff is totally fine, and he's telling you about how he fled his country and how they're going to execute him if he ever goes back. And he says, my wife's right after me, please be kind to her or whatever, and then leaves. And you walk in and you notice that her passport's expired by like 12 days.
Yeah.
And like the correct answer, I mean, you pause, right? Because the game is telling you you should send this person back, right? But morally, you know what you really should do. And I love the fact that the game even addresses that. If you actually let her through, different things happen.
And additionally, you have family pressure too, because if you're not doing well, your family's going to starve, they're not going to be housed, all that sort of stuff too.
Yeah.
And one thing I thought was neat about it is, the fact that he probably did it with floppy graphics just to get it out the door, because it's easy and cheap, but it also was very visceral. A lot of work has been done in looking at transference for when you're playing a game, when you transfer that knowledge, the learning, the context outside of it. And if you're playing a fantasy game that's very, like, let's say high fantasy, you're not going to transfer those concepts as easily or as viscerally as if it's in some context that you know. And the fact that that's kind of like what games were, I mean, granted with some changes, but that type of graphics, that type of sound back then, it contextualized it in history for those of us who remember playing games back then.
Well, and even more than that, so much of it is very reminiscent of the old Soviet bloc art, right?
Yeah.
Which brings back, that really puts you in the place of the period. So I think that's excellent. Another one is, have you guys all gotten a chance to play this War of Mine? A couple of people, you should all play this War of Mine. Have you gotten a chance to check it out?
I have not yet, no.
It's fantastic. Well, right, it's engaging but not fun.
I love playing it, but I don't.
Right, no, there were moments, I had to quit that game because of a moment within that game. So if you don't know, this War of Mine is about being a civilian during the siege of a city, right? During when a city is being sort of occupied and fought over by two different armies. And it's just about living through that. And it's very intense, right? It's about Serbian-Bosnian conflict, but there are so many moments in it where you find yourself wandering through, you find yourself scavenging, right? You've got a couple people
I've
left.
killed innocent people.
Right, no, I had this
That would
moment.
have never killed me, probably.
There's so many, so I had this moment where I was scavenging, and you probably will remember this moment. And I get to this place, and I've got some people at home who I've got to feed, right? If I can, who need medicine, all these sort of things, who need better shelter. And I'm out trying to scavenge, go through these old supermarkets, all this sort of thing. And I get to this one place, and I hear, and this was the brutalest moment. I had to quit the game after this, and then come back to it weeks later. I hear from the other side of the door this soldier shouting at a woman, basically trying to coerce her into sex, right? I mean, he's going to rape this woman. And I pause, because it was this choice that I couldn't make, right? Because you know that if you let this guy go, if you don't intervene, right, all I've got on me is a shovel. So what am I going to do anyway? And if I don't intervene, the soldier's going to go off and disappear somewhere, and I'll be able to get much more food and medicine and take the things that I need for the people who are waiting for me who depend on me at home. And I literally couldn't make that choice, right? I've been privileged enough to never have to make a choice like that in my life. And yet, millions of people on this earth do. And I think that's how powerful games can be, to bring us into the shoes of others and make us aware of these political and moral realities that we may never have experienced. And especially when our political system is dealing with some of these realities, have some connection to these abstract events to better inform how we vote, how we think about them.
And we're used to certain narratives within games, certain mechanics. This is what you do. You go around shooting people in a shooter. And when you sort of reflect back on some of what you're doing, which seem like innocent game mechanics, my favorite example was when I was growing up, I was playing Chrono Trigger. And in the beginning of that, you can go around, you collect items. It's an RPG for those of you who are too young to have played that. And at the time, you went into people's houses, you collected the treasure chests, you broke their pots, like Link does. And in Chrono Trigger, in the beginning, you go, if you take somebody's lunch, you eat it, you get your hit points refilled or something like that. But then later in the game, you get judged for all of that. You get on trial because of something that anybody wants to play. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but you get on trial, and these character witnesses come up and testify against you if you made those choices. Now we see that in games all the time, but at the time it was shocking. So looking at the current game mechanics that we're all used to, what sort of game mechanics, just like open question for everybody to think about, what sort of game mechanics do you take for granted that have political implications?
There's one, I think, that, sadly, that's that whole going into houses and taking it, but that still goes on in RPG.
Gaming.
But the one thing I feel that, one gaming thing when you do is that they be vulnerability of like, you can do whatever you want, you like this stuff, you can do all this type of stuff. You are the one-man army and such, which, we were talking like a Call of Duty or stuff like that. Not saying unintentional racism and such, because I understand that there are terrorists who are, some terrorists, all this type of stuff, they exist and they do horrible things, but once you have this huge game that says brown people are bad, and you have to go and kill them, or worse, or this brown person is only good as your sidekick. They can't be the leading person. That does bother me. Just like why can't the save the day?
Well, and if we look at it, right, we've always needed a generic enemy. We've gone from Native Americans to Nazis to Russians to Middle Eastern people, right? For some reason, our culture has, especially specifically American culture, maybe it's just because we export more entertainment than anyone else in the world, has always had to pick it. There has to be somebody it's okay to shoot, right? And we see it. I mean, it parallels the times perfectly.
A great example, EVE Online. They have one server that they use for pretty much all of the world, and due to China's laws, they have a separate server that they run only in China. What's fascinating is that the rest of the world, because it has a lot of Europeans, a lot of Americans play the game, it's very, very factionistic, very war-heavy, and things like that. There's always people trying to sneak in and sabotage and destroy the thing. And within China, because it's only China, they're playing with Chinese, there's like 3 factions, and they're all kind of at peace with each other, and it's not that popular of a game.
This is good, but it's like, again, poor teacher. I wish I could play more of these games, and I got to look at the Papers, Please, because I heard about it last year, but more than anything, what I think it emphasizes is the lack of subtlety in it. But as James brought up about how it brought up objectivism, the original Bioshock, just to close this point, it's funny because you look into it and it can give you a black and white attitude of it, but there's still the subtlety in it. If you all remember the character of Bill McDonough in the original game, he's basically Rapture's carpenter. And there's a line in Atlas Shrugged that's almost exactly like that, where he asks John Galt, he says, "Are you in charge of this city?" in the case, which is Rapture essentially in the book, and he says, "No, me, I'm just the carpenter." You know, so even if Andrew Ryan is extremely unsubtle, Bill McDonough is referred to as his conscience. So even though he lets the politics and his certainty, moral certainty, control it, it still has that subtle elements to allow the audience to decide for themselves. And I like that kind of stuff because it sure gets a reputation, especially in political circles, and I don't think that's fair. Not to go too far, but it's not all that dissimilar from the Bible, you know, like a lot of people who don't even bother to read the book and draw all kinds of conclusions from it. And I went out and saw it after I noted the connections to Bioshock, and I deliberately read it again for that very reason, because I don't think you should draw conclusions without actually looking at a book, be it Atlas Shrugged or many other ones. And now other topics, so there we go.
I saw some more hands up.
Oh, sure, yeah. Who else had hands up, or just in general? Yeah, introduction topics or comments in general. Sure.
Well, I was wondering, because you led with Bioshock Infinite, is it better than nothing to at least have, you know, these small moments where it doesn't go in depth, but it allows us to have conversations afterwards where we're like, man, that makes me think deeper. Not because it hands it to me on a plate, but it gives me an opportunity. Like, is Bioshock Infinite better than if you just cut those things all out?
I had an expectation in my mind, and it wasn't quite fulfilled, but as I tried to say, in, say, a conscientious person who will want to examine it and go beyond it, kudos to it for that and bringing it to the conversation. And also, it's a great topic introducer because it's recent, it's popular, and certainly more so than, say, Nothing Chrono Trigger. I'm sure most of us know about it, but in terms of like sheer numbers, Bioshock, I think, is a good way to lead.
So I would actually take the opposite viewpoint and say that there's a fine line between touching on a topic to allow us to discuss and trivializing a topic, right? And there were moments in Bioshock, like the racism moment, that I felt like really trivialized it. I felt like they used it for shock value. And then you find yourself shooting plenty of African American people. You find yourself shooting plenty of workers after you hear sort of about the plight of the proletariat, right? Without a second thought. And so I think it is better if we can touch on these things, bring them up, but only if then we remember that we brought them up and don't trivialize them as we continue. Yes, go.
Well, we were talking a little bit ago, just amongst ourselves, about Spec Ops: The Line. And what you were saying, like, I think that these political points only really make sense when they are involved in gameplay. Mm-hmm. Like, Spec Ops: The Line was talking about, you know, we think that we're the hero, we think that whatever we do is good, you know, those are the bad people and we're going to get them, and we have this moral certainty. And it reinforces that by having you blow away these people, and you don't even realize why you're doing it. And it brings it up near the end of the game. Why did you do this? Why are you still doing this? Every time you die and reload, it says, do you feel like a hero yet? And it sort of reinforces the whole point that the game was making. But like Bioshock Infinite, the points it seems like they were trying to make didn't touch on gameplay. Like, gameplay and narrative were in separate bubbles. And so I don't think it was effective.
So going on to that, with looking at reputation systems, so if you have a reputation system about how you, like some sort of meritocracy, what are you measuring? And those sort of things can drastically change the internal politics within the organization itself, whether it's a corporation or government or society. So if these are the things that are good, these are the things that are bad, now you can start polarizing people, they start optimizing within them. And let's say that you have a slight bias about something like, oh, you know, maybe there's a small tendency for this one group of people to behave a certain way. Well, then it gets amplified and amplified and amplified. And so even though most of the people aren't like that, there's a small subset that behave like that, and now the stereotype just explodes. And we can see this mathematically too. A lot of my work is looking at the mathematics of game theory and reputation and trust and stuff like that. And it's without even considering the context, just these are the mechanics, here's what happens, it explodes.
Snake back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a few questions. Because the Metal Gear series, whenever you hear politics, they immediately think that each game has its own political message in some way. The first one is about nuclear war. The second one is a bit about censorship towards the end of the game. The third one is about loyalty to the country, as well as just getting to game mechanics. Specifically for this is the boss one mentions the Sorrow. This is a boss that you come against, and he is a tougher boss to fight if you go through the game murdering everyone, because the ghosts of everyone you fight come back. And by the way, in all of your games, you can play totally blood-free runs. You can just stun and move on, or sneak around totally silent. Or you can just go on a murderous rampage and kill everything in sight. But it's nice that this game, it gives you that sort of choice. Do I want to be a killer and just level everything? Or do I want to be a bit more subtle about it? Do I want to do my job and not be a mindless savage?
It tries to lead you, but it's good that it gives you the choice. Unfortunately, I haven't played any of the Metal Gear games. Some are expensive, but I'll get around to it eventually. But right there, 80s, John Rambo, John Matrix, Solid Snake, fits right in, but then it's good that it gives you that choice, that you don't have to necessarily be like that, you know?
Well, and I think that the River of Souls is one of the more powerful moments, especially that early, to remind us of exactly what we're doing. And from everything I've heard from Kojima, he does want to make people aware that these things can be resolved non-violently, right? That is a big part of the message. Usually the best ending in the game is if you actually achieve not killing anyone. And so I do think it is a powerful point, and all those games do it very well, especially since they put you in the shoes of that sort of American superhero, right? And then tell you, no, the American superhero, if you're really a superhero, you should not be killing people.
Right, and in 3, that's the big thing.
Yeah.
You're doing this because that's your duty to your country.
Yep.
But at the same time, the boss, the person who trained you, taught you everything you know, they defected. And you wonder why they did that. And eventually, I'm not going to spoil anything to anyone, but you do have to make some very difficult decisions in this game towards the end. And that kind of changes the character. He questions, is my loyalty to my country? What should a soldier be? And that also leads into the next games and sort of where the rest of the Metal Gear plot goes. It's not just fighting soldiers fighting for a country, it's them fighting for themselves. And it kind of brings this whole other just sort of questionable morality and everything. And it just goes to show that nation states aren't always the most peaceful things.
The nature of morality, I'm glad you brought that up because it leads me to the other big one besides government, which is religion, and try and touch it on it in games. And the two that always come to mind is where it doesn't feel like, similar to what James said about it just being, and it's actually true because you can quantify it. In this particular case, it's Xenogears because of the fate of that game and how the second disc especially. But for a long time before I actually had played it, they put it right on the marketing. You are the slayer of God, and that's just a gotcha phrase because it couldn't be further from the truth at all in that game, that what you're doing, and it will bring you up notions that hopefully get you thinking about it, but in some ways it does do a disservice. But I think it gives you the opportunity, if you are thoughtful, to want to look into it and learn more about it.
Well, one fascinating thing to do, I just recommend for everybody, is when let's say that you've got a game that you really like, and you think maybe it has some religious interpretations, or maybe it even doesn't. Go out there and find some review sites, like a Christian review site, an Islamic review site, and read their interpretations of them. And some of it may very drastically surprise you. Some game that you might think is, this game could not have any possible religious implications, and they're interpreting it does. Maybe very good or very bad, and it can be extremely surprising.
Well, and we very rarely recognize just how much of an impact religion has on our society as a whole, right? On all of these games, and we just did an episode on Chutes and Ladders, right? And Chutes and Ladders is a deeply religious game. And almost every fantasy game I have ever played, walk into a graveyard in a fantasy game, and you'll see like half the graves are crosses. Why would they be crosses in this fantasy universe, right? But we don't even think about it, right? There's so much of this stuff. You'll see Mass Effect has a chapter, we talked about this too, called House Divided, right? House Divided, not only a Lincoln speech, but Lincoln pulled it from the Bible. And so there's so much of this stuff that just adheres in our culture that pervades our art because it's just part of our national subconscious. That I always think it's really interesting digging into those facets of it.
Let's see something all the way back there, blue shirt. Yep.
It feels like you're, I don't mean to overly analyze what you're saying, but it feels like you're kind of going with the rabbit hole. It's like, if you go like across the Bible for like Lincoln's and then compare it to like people from the Bible, and then compare it to like aspect. I mean, at that point in time, it's just a phrase that you should be using, not necessarily connecting to the Bible.
So I actually talked to the developers, and it was. They took it from, they used it specifically because both Lincoln used it and it was relevant, the biblical use was relevant as well. And they used it because the moral choice it was around specifically was informed and discussed both the topics that Lincoln was discussing and the biblical topic. As designers, right, especially on good games, the designers usually don't choose things. I mean, great games aren't made by accident, right? These things are actually very carefully considered. Something to add?
There was a game. There was a Left Behind game. It was made a number of years ago.
Yes, there's actually 3 that have been made now.
Okay,
did you play the RTS?
I've just seen videos. And I just played it.
Wow! Oh my God, it was. I was thinking that. Oh my God.
Yeah. So there was in designing this game around the tenets of the religion. And you can help me fill in some of this because it's been a while. It's pretty hazy for me. But they wanted certain outcomes. Like they always wanted good to win no matter what. So how do you make a game where you cannot lose? And that's kind of a fascinating question too. Is it a game?
Well, we brought up the other day, have you played America's Army?
A long time ago, yeah.
So some of you guys may be familiar with this anecdote, but in America's Army, you play, it's a recruiting tool for the American military. It's sent out to be frank, it's a way for them to also reach out to people who aren't quite 18 yet, which is not legal to send recruiters to. But it's a recruiting tool, and in some ways it's very positive, right? There's a lot of like CPR training, and there's a lot more actual military things it teaches you, and some actually decent moral values. But here's the genius thing. The Army specified it could never be positive to shoot American soldiers, right? So okay, no problem. Single player game, no problem. How do you do that in multiplayer, right? You think about Counter-Strike, you think about Call of Duty, and one side, the terrorists, and one side, the Americans, right? Well, in this game, if I'm playing against you, right? My team's the Americans, I see you guys as terrorists. Your team, from your perspective, you see you as the Americans, and my avatar appears as the terrorist skin. And if you're spectating, you see both teams as Middle Eastern terrorists fighting each other.
There reminds me of another game, and if anyone can help me remember what this is, it's a recent political game that you can basically there's 2 actions in the game. There's a war of Darfur.
Darfur's dying?
Darfur's dying, yeah. Where you have 2 actions. You can either there's a civil war going on. There's all these attacks. You can intervene or not intervene. Regardless of what you do, people die and they hate you because you intervened and you messed it all up, or you didn't intervene and people died and you didn't help.
There's another one. Oh, I forget what it's called. I think it may just be called Drone Strike. But there's one where you see, it's like a little top-down.
Black Lope thinks it's a terrorist, right? And then you try to hit it. And then you hit other civilians, and you cause more terrorists.
Right, so that's exactly what it is. You control a little missile, right? And you're dropping missiles, and you're supposed to take out the terrorists. And it's this big crowded marketplace, and you'll see these terrorists run through, and they're indicated by wearing bombs or whatever. And you hit one, and you kill them. But you'll almost inevitably in the blast catch some innocent civilians. Okay. And that causes the people nearby, their relations, their family, to become terrorists, right?
So you mentioned Xenogears and religion, and the funny thing is, I got Xenogears and Final Fantasy Tactics around the same time.
Yeah.
And Xenogears seems so much less anti-religious than Final Fantasy Tactics.
Yes.
Which basically just takes the full-on same control cycles, executed at Wolverine, and just takes it all. It's like they're the bad guys. The church is the bad guy. Because it's just following so much of the European history.
The backstory, but it's said best in the quote by Tom Slattery, who is the localization expert, that they do it several times throughout the game, that they refer to it as the princess, I forgot her exact name, but she refers to as like praise be the gods and stuff like that. It's not, even though Lavados is supposed to be, you know, at least the perception, but at the same time it's only a subtle hope because there are many gods in the world of tactics. And the Luke of Ai, if you want, or how they exactly relate to them. Was a Jorah possessed by Ultima beforehand or after the fact? It leaves you open to think about it, even though you're right, it is completely unsubtle at certain times, especially with the Knights Templar. The first time I played the game, I thought that was so front and center, I actually forgot what the name of the main villain was, because he was more like a force than an actual character, Vormoth, the Tengil, yeah, that's his name, yeah.
You know, speaking of religion in games, you know, one of the massacres, you have Shepherd, the Good Shepherd, Normandy, Legion, you know, that type of stuff. But also a game, an RPG that, you know, someone no one talk about being actual religion. Let's see, Grandia 2, an old Dreamcast game that you know, I don't want to spoil everything, is that it starts off you fighting against a possessed priestess, and she actually, you know, this priestess goes to the church, their version of the Pope, and it gets a little crazier after that. And,
so many games to play.
Yeah, it's, you know, and it's, you know, it's a huge twist that I won't spoil, because if you just play it, it's like, oh my goodness, you know, that sort of thing. But yeah, when I think of, like, you know, it's not really blatantly anti-religious, because I don't know, because I am a Christian or play these games, you know, but it just shocked me, you know, saying that how this whole, like, they can make you think this is good, you see something's good, you see something, but yet it can lead you to something, you know, the other way. Just, you know, it's like you always have to be, you gotta be ever watchful. That's what I think.
Well, history is always written by the victor,
Yeah.
and this is very important. Who here has played Braid? A few people? Okay. Braid. Yeah, Braid. I hate to spoil this, but you turn out you are the bad guy, and you don't realize it until you beat the game. And this is just a strong revelation. And you look at things like Dungeon Keeper. That's kind of a bit of that's quite an older game. I forget if they're coming up with a new one, but you play as the guy who's in the dungeon, and the hero is the one who's trying to kill all your guys, and you're making all these monsters to try to keep and grow your dungeon. And one thing that I like to talk about is Lord of the Rings from the perspective of Sauron. There's a book written by a Russian guy. I've heard it's not that great to read, but if you think about it, imagine Lord of the Rings from the perspective of Sauron. He's uniting all of these underclass people who've been repressed for many generations, and against the aristocracy who are all very similar and don't like technology. They don't want to move ahead. They don't want these advancements and things to be put in the hands of other folks. So if you look at it from the other perspective, I think games are very, because you want the player to feel engaged in it and feel like they have a goal, you have to tell it from the winner's side, but whose side do you want to make the game from?
Let's see. Over here. Behind.
This is kind of jumping back a bit, but this is just sort of a trend I've noticed in a lot of more recent shooters specifically, or not even all shooters, but the whole idea that, you know, we went from like Russians to Chinese people to like Arabic people as enemies, and I'm noticing that like in a lot of games that now it's a lot of we're shooting white people that look a lot like American soldiers and PMCs mostly. Like Call of Duty Advanced Warfare had that whole the second half of the game you're fighting PMCs. This War of Mine, you know, what do the soldiers look like in that? Even Spec Ops: The Line, you're shooting other fellow American soldiers, but you're also, you know, it's kind of the whole, as she was saying with the "do you feel like a hero yet" thing is like it's all just like these giant moral gray areas.
It's a universal theme, but no, by no means is it bad to go back, because I'm glad you want to, because we can always do this next year and keep going, like kind of like the video game 2 and 1. They're like on the 11th one, we can do politics 2, 3, 4. They'll keep having me, and you guys will keep coming, and you find people too. Thank you. But the specific question, I think it is a universalist theme because it wants you to present it, and it might have its side, but I think it wants you to think about it again. I think it is ingrained in our DNA, though, to be like that, to make you want to think about things rather than say one specific perspective. You know, I mean, And I think that's why you've got to be subtle about these kind of things as opposed to, as they said in 7, you know, hit people with a sledgehammer. You know, I don't like that kind of stuff.
So my only thing about this was that I think that we're having a couple of games start to look at this question of having a private, non-regulated military, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it is an important question. This war of mine, actually, the opposing side is not the opposing, it's just other people, right? Other people in this city. For most part, this is a civil war, right? And so even the soldiers are just the people who lived here, right? For the new Call of Duty, it was most interesting to me that they brought it in the new Call of Duty, right? Because that's when you know it's been normalized as a culture. And it's an interesting question to me about, we'll see over the next couple of years, if we start discussing that larger issue and whether as a culture we have sort of turned against this idea of outsourcing violence. We'll see.
Okay.
To touch on, I guess, religion again,
Sure.
in games. It was kind of, I mean, yeah, Final Fantasy has a history of being somewhat anti-religious, but like for kids, for little kids, or kids, even preteens and teenagers, some of them wouldn't pick up on a lot of that stuff. They would say like, oh, that's just a fake religion, like that doesn't mean anything for real life, even though a lot of it was like, you know, directly influenced. So, I mean, for an American standpoint, besides all the people who are calling D&D and video games the devil's playthings for all reasons, ignoring them, it's like no one was criticizing Final Fantasy for being anti-religious, except maybe a very small vocal section, a very small section. It wasn't even being that vocal. And then we have a game like Assassin's Creed, where the main character is very anti-mainstream religion. He's Altair writes all these things like the church doesn't, you can't think for yourself and such and so. And then the second game, they put the disclaimer that we all have this is made by a group of people with very different religious views and very different life experiences. And it's like they had to do that because they put such a huge, obvious anti-religion message in a AAA game.
The aspects, yeah. But the specific point on Final Fantasy, I feel, again, going a little bit more mainstream or something necessarily that a lot of people have played. The one game that I feel that it's pretty unsubtle about it, and it's unfortunate because the subsequent sequel, 10 and 10-2, to the point that people find it unbelievable that they attempt to give the Church of Yevon a little bit more nuance and say that, to quote from, I think the way they sum it up best in 10 was a review where they would say, what you learn quickly in the story about 10 as you're a foreigner in the land, you see how flawed the mindless tradition of obedience is. And that obviously is pretty an anti, that's what the game is doing, but in general, there are several traditions in that game that I think it's trying to critique, even if they criticize the religion as first and foremost in that game.
I was always so sad that 10-2 wasn't about Ornbrecht and Jaska's previous journey.
Yeah, they were talking about 10-3 as well.
Do you remember though, when a lot of people said they found that unbelievable that they wanted to bring some subtlety in 10-2 to Yevon because of how they're bad in 10, And I found that a little bit refreshing,
But yeah, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, sorry.
Just now that we're back on the topic of religion, there's two things I have to mention. First of all, I think any of the Shin Megami Tensei games, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, they always have some sort of religious bent to it. Devil Summoner, Demon Summoner, any of the Persona games. But I'm trying to remember which one it is. One of the older one of the older games, and you have a choice to make. There is a sort of mainstream church that's on one side of this in this post-apocalyptic war, and there's a sort of cult that's doing its own thing against it in this other side. And there's all these political factions, and you as a player, you can choose, I want this faction, I want this faction, or you can choose to try to remain politely neutral as best as you can. And that actually does influence the ending of the game. No matter who you side with, pretty much everyone dies. Not everyone dies anyway, but there's not really a good ending to this game unless the least worst ending is at neutral, pretty much.
The least worst. Over here?
The other game that I wanted to mention.
Oh, sorry.
Back into Persona 4, and what you mentioned earlier about seeing what Christian sites review things. I found this one site, someone mentioned it a while back in the forum, It's a Christian review site, but they put their bias right there so you know what their view is. And they actually divide the score into two separate scores. They have one score that looks at just gameplay, just characters, just plot, just graphics, just everything as how a game is supposed to function. And then they have a different review score in terms of the religious aspects. Is it offensive? Is it this? Is it that? And the two scores can be totally different. Like their Persona game, or Persona 4, if anyone's played it, it's relatively lighthearted. It does have some subtle religious influences in it. And they rate that game as a 98 out of 100 for its mechanics score, but they gave it like an F for its religious score.
It's good that they at least try and do that rather than like the example as I was telling near the end was Ninja Gaiden. They're praising it in 2004, and they say, sorry, it's got pagan influence in it, F. You know? I believe that was Christian Gamer too.
But it's also a testament to how game companies make games for the markets. If you're making it, like if you compare American versus European, you'll get away with more violence in America, you get away with more sexuality or nudity in Europe. If you want to sell to China, want to include the Chinese market, now you have to be nice to the Chinese government. There's certain things you can and can't say. If you want to sell in Germany, you can't use any swastikas, even if it's a World War II game. And so you start to see where is the company targeting it, and then they have to sort of appease all these different markets at the same time. And so the games, in a sense, reinforce certain types of politics. Over here.
When you touch, I'm sorry.
Then we'll get you.
When you touched upon Final Fantasy X and the Advent of religion and everything, when it came to characterization and morality, when everyone asked me, like, who's your favorite character in Final Fantasy X, I was like, well, obviously it's going to be Auron, right? Because Auron's a really cool badass. But then I said, but the most interesting character for me was Wakka. And they're like, why? He sucks. Like, no. As a character, Wakka's very interesting because he's the man who's the most religious of them all. But as the game progresses, he's the one who gets his faith questioned time and time and time again. You see the Mazers doing stuff, the Crusaders using up Machina, and he
has moral crisis.
He has a very deep moral crisis. How his brother Chapu was killed, and he had the sword that he left to use a Machina weapon. And I said, well, Wakka is actually the most interesting character for me because of how many times he has to be questioned, and in front of everyone too. Like he's getting his faith questioned time and time and time again, and slowly he begins to realize how false it is. And he doesn't denounce it totally, but he just says, some things are just wrong.
It's good that he's reasonable enough to do that. And Auron, on the surface is, but I think he sums up his character pretty well. Like, he kind of rejects his own legend when he says, legendary guardian, right after you fight the big monster guy, is that whatever his name is? He goes, back then I was just a boy or something like that. So he kind of says, like, yeah, you can think I'm special, but knowing what I know now, it really is almost unfair. And back there,
Yeah, I was going to say, looking at how the regional influence on games, some games are changed too slightly for each market. So Indigo Prophecy in the US was released, but it has another name that Russians not allowed to have, so used like in other countries.
It's actually called Fahrenheit.
Yeah. And then they also had certain sex scenes that were in the game but not in the American version because they had to take them out.
And we do this, we do this a great deal, right? Because each region has not only its own likes and dislikes, but also things like our ASRB. The one that I've had to deal with a lot is you literally cannot ship to Germany, even if you're building a World War II game, which is anywhere in it, right? It's against the law. China has a number of these regulations, some of which are very strange. Singapore, drug use, right? You can't show drug use in your game. And so we do have a lot of these regional variations that we make, and sometimes even, for example, we were just talking about Persona 4. In the Japanese version of Persona 4, one of the characters is fairly explicitly gay. In the American release, they made it much, much, much more ambiguous on purpose, right? So we do a lot of regional changing.
And that's where it ties into, like, even if the politics are clear, you have to ask, who are they trying to appeal to, or are they covering their bottom line, like with the asterisks, like you said, well, not the asterisks, but the disclaimer in Assassin's Creed, because their bottom line is still clear, and even if they are trying to make one, they still got to try and account for everything, they're not trying to get up on soapbox, because that would hurt their bottom line.
But at the same time, there's some target demo that they're shooting after, and so they want to reinforce those norms and really get into those people's heads, but then they don't want to do anything harmful to other groups, and that really guides it. It's really profit is guiding many of the large games.
Let's see,
over here, I guess.
Yeah. We'll try to get to everybody. Yeah.
Like some games that can be like, one game, like unintentionally little things like the Uncharted series. Like, I like the games a lot, but sometimes like the places you're going to, like the people you're fighting are usually like different. Like first game you're fighting with a bunch of small pirate, and then the second game you're fighting with like a bunch of Russians. And usually there's some sort of artifact that people worship that usually turns out to be evil for some reason. Like, yeah, like basically and things like usually from America be unintentionally racist because he's usually like gunning down like those other races and fighting artifacts from supposedly like religious artifacts from different religions.
It reeks of Eurocentrism, but I still think it leaves the opportunity for you to, like you kind of articulate there, like it's imprecise to describe what it's trying to say, and it makes you just kind of question it. At least it would for me. At least I hope it wants to make you question it. Just like, okay, this is evil because the game says so, or because is that exactly what the developers are trying to carry as part of the culture?
And I mean, I think we do. I think that as designers, we have a responsibility. You'll see, especially in certain big popcorn games or in this accidental racism. I'm going to go back to Call of Juarez because I almost had to laugh. It was so bad. There's one achievement in the game for killing the most possible people on a specific level. This is also a level where you drive into the ghetto and every single enemy is either African American or Latino, right? And so there's literally a killing black people achievement in the game. And they just didn't even think about it, right? So I think we also have a responsibility. And as consumers, we have a responsibility to call out developers on these sort of things. We've talked about Assassin's Creed a lot, right? We've seen them take flack for a lot of things. And over the course of the series, and I think they will continue to do so, they've become more sensitive to some of these things themselves because consumers have said, no, this wouldn't fly with us.
And it can get really complicated when it comes down to managing a business too. When I was producer for Akron, the time travel RTS, we had our story all fleshed out and whatnot, and I only have so much time in my day. I had an assistant producer, but there's a lot of things to manage. We had about 52 people working on it total. And at the end, I remember I got a bunch of art and I'm like, okay, approve this, approve that, approve that. And I realized that we had written in the beginning the diversity of characters and all sort of stuff. And by the end, it was very heavily weighted towards white guys, white males. And it wasn't like there was nobody actively doing it, but when the person read the description about this, that's what they had in their mind at the time. And because you didn't have as much time to devote to that, you didn't see it until it all came together and you already spent the money.
Well, and this is one of those questions of just diversity in the office place too. Very often on many of the large teams I've worked on, we still have a very small portion of the team that isn't white male. And so coming from a white male perspective and seeing a character description, we're not going to think twice about this character just being a white male, right? But when we start getting some more diversity, we may have people who are like, oh wait, we don't have any character that reflects. That would be much more in the industry consciousness. So hopefully that'll change over the next couple of years. It'll be easier to catch those things.
When it comes to that, the one I appreciate it the most, because be it in an ethnic, maybe not an ethnic, but a clear debate like how they would phrase the second invasion of Ethiopia by Italy prior to World War I, they simply referred to the Ethiopians as having spears, and it didn't talk anything about the revenge or anything. You got to keep it, when you're doing a survey, of course, you got to do it very quickly. And that's why I appreciate the Extra Credit series, because they would do the same thing about Extra History. They would do the same thing about World War I, making clear they were the aristocrats. They didn't care that a war was inevitable, but they make it very clear with Portales and Sazonov that they were trying to do everything they could to prevent it. And our books can't do that for expediency, but they will leave open as a supplement to yours, and hopefully others will want to look at that and look into it. Well, and it's not just, we're going to start a war and they don't care, because that's not how it was.
And in games, even things like Crusader Kings or whatever, when you step into some of those roles, you understand how difficult this was, that it's not just that these guys didn't care and this war started, but how there were so many forces that were just bigger than them, right? And no matter how desperately they tried, by trying to do so yourself and failing, you see just how monumental of a problem this is, which is tragic. Huge, part of the power of games, which I think is really important. But do we want to rapid fire? I know we're running out of time. This ends at 5:30?
Well, you said you had to go somewhere else, but
I got on at 6.
Yeah, there is nothing else in here until 6, so he said he was okay with that if you do want to stay, and I'd love to hear more, because we got a whole other, even though we're mostly talking about games, I was going to tie it into the real world a little bit, but I also want to hear from the rest too, so please.
Yeah, Christianity, I always like mention Final Fantasy X and Assassin's Creed. A lot of times they portray Christianity, and what I hate is when they show religions. I want to say Final Fantasy X and I remember asking about that game, where a lot of times they show Christianity and you show like the negatives, and they always emphasize the negatives, especially with Christianity, and you see a lot of like JRPGs, but it's like you don't do too well about giving a real fair balance. And a lot of times my biggest issue is like, why is it always Christianity? So a bunch of other religions, why is it always Christianity being attacked? Why not like, Buddhism or Islamic faith? It's always the same religion.
So I have two answers to that, and there's a couple of things, right? I personally am agnostic in the true sense, right? I've spent my entire life looking and never found. I found very valuable things in many different religions. And so I find it really interesting that we do tend to simply attack religion, but I think there's two aspects to it. I mean, A, Christianity is just the largest out there, right? B, after World War II, and this is my speculation, my understanding from just my personal work with some Japanese developers, but post-World War II, there was a lot of societal attempt for them to understand why they lost, right? Because coming into World War II as a society, not as individuals, but as a society, there was this idea that some of the martial valor and discipline and all the other things that were characteristic of Japanese society couldn't possibly lose, were better, were morally superior to sort of our lazy Americans, right? And then they lose, and a lot of the culture has been trying to interpret American culture, especially because during the occupation it all came in, and so there's so much Japanese work trying to understand this religion which they lost to, right? In some ways, I mean, Japan has the biggest remaining animist religion in the world, right? Shinto. And why did that lose to this other religion where people worship a dead deity about peace, right? And so there's a lot of cultural interpretation. I mean, how many of you guys watch a fair amount of anime? Christianity comes up so much in your anime, right? Right. Like Neon Genesis, right? Everything. And so one, I think in Japanese, it's cultural interpretation. And two, many of the flaws that we see in Christianity are very temporal flaws, right? Things that come from either a mass church itself and the idea of organized religion, or this idea of following a strict doctrine, not interpreting the Bible yourself, but being told what to do. Those are very easy, small things to pick apart, right? It's very easy to hit those. The deeper, more spiritual things, addressing the idea of faith is very, very difficult. I mean, even when you have whole books to talk about it. And so within the context of the game, we've struggled with really approaching the positive side of Christianity in a respectful way, just because it's much harder to do than to point out some of the flaws.
And another thing to keep in mind is that religion has many facets. There's the mythology, and many people that don't disbelieve or attack that. There is the community, and that provides a lot of support for people. If you're going to say, here's an organization that feeds the homeless, that gives you a sense of community, that gives you a sense of awe, that makes you feel peaceful, those are all wonderful, positive things, even if you disagree with the mythology. So you have to be careful about if you're attacking, if you don't believe in the mythology, the rest of it still has to come from somewhere. It provides a lot of value and a lot of service.
I think it was articulated best by one of the deleted scenes in Ben-Hur, where he was actually played. Let me see if I remember. Leslie Nielsen was playing. Who's the villain again? Masala, and he says to him, "There's this new cult." Of course, they refer to Christianity as a cult because it's just I forgot the exact date of it, but he refers to it as like, there's something very interesting about that. They don't have many gods. The central message is it's all about peace and love, and not a bunch of like the Greek or Roman co-opted gods are always fighting with each other, incest. And he says that's a very appealing notion. And then unfortunately, like you were saying, it got co-opted and by those who seek power or influence. But the message is nice, and I think that covers it very well, that particular clip, in 3 minutes and less. Let's see. Over here.
Two quick questions, actually. One is, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Trigun at all.
Works not.
I'm looking for my wormwood in video games. I'm looking for that kind of storyline. I don't know if any of you guys know of something like that. And second, how you feel about video games as political education. More along the lines of something like Crusader Kings. Like, for example, I didn't know exactly what a domain was until I played that game.
So, I think as political education, they can be excellent. Have you played Democracy 3?
I've seen it lately.
So it looks much more imposing than it is, but I have at times gotten, when I had free time, I would do courses with high school students where I would assign them all roles in the government, and then we'd play Democracy 3, but not as individuals making the choices, but they would all have to vote and argue about it and all this stuff. And it was a powerful civics tool, right? Instead of teaching them civics out of a textbook, having them work through civics in an interactive fashion, having them live through that experience was much more powerful. So I think that our games as interactive tools are very good for teaching our civic responsibilities.
I use them whenever possible, and occasionally, I think the most polite way someone, and this is a job interview no less, she said, well, that was certainly an interesting lesson when I was tying in Modern Warfare 3 to the Civil War, and I'm sure she meant it negatively, like you just screwed yourself, but to me, it's not something that's going to go, oh darn, I got to be politically correct now and not do it, because I know that the essential hiring process has absolutely nothing to do with my actual ability to teach. So I'm not going to say, oh, can't do that anymore, you know.
One thing that I feel like we did not touch on at all is conservatism versus liberal, or looking for like progressivism.
Let's do it again next year.
Yeah. And so just one other message is, a lot of video games, you're the protagonist and you want to change something, you're trying to change something profoundly, versus a lot of people who do not want to see things change, those are conservative. And really, you can boil a lot of world politics into people who want to change and people who don't want to change. And some things are good the way they are, some things are not. And people in general don't want to change the way that they are, generally speaking, but those who want, this is getting kind of meta here, but those who want to change don't want to change the way that they want to change. And a lot of the core divides we see between people are just exactly that, about change.
Not to be too, you know, because I believe in moderation and moderate specifically, like, you know, I can reconcile it. Usually I can say something that is kind of piercing, like saying for conservatism, I will say, there's very little about modern conservatism that needs to be conserved, right, in the principle. But then I will also believe, say, a general to, you know, even it out by saying, I miss people like William F. Buckley, because he believed in more of conversation, not like, you hate America, like nowadays and stuff, you know, bring the conversation. And I think both sides have something to contribute. And I think that's what America's about, a compromise, you know, ultimately.
And one thing is that just psychologically speaking, people, if you believe something strongly, and you're presented with evidence to the contrary, your natural instinct is to fight it and believe more strongly. And this is shown in psychology, this is shown in political literature, everywhere you look. And when we have these media across the world, we can communicate very quickly, rapidly, and iterate on them. We get stuck in these things where both sides get further apart, we believe harder and harder and harder. And another one of the things that pushes it further is when you deal with a first-past-post voting system, electoral system. Mathematically, it pushes you towards two parties. And so now we have the psychological mechanism, and then we have a representation system that pushes towards two parties, and there's a lot of divide there.
Well, and it's interesting to me how very rarely we have gotten to explore other political options within games, right? I've never seen a really good parliamentary electoral game.
With approval voting or border count or something like that.
Right,
yeah.
Or yeah, percentage representation. Yeah. And I think that'd be fascinating, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't let, you know, like, I mean, that's one of the things that's hard to reconcile. We've been to the point, just in terms of, you know, like the statistics of it, similar to electoral, where we become the wage earners, and we have the power to decide it, and they say there are forces that hold it back, so maybe it's not that quantifiable, maybe it will take more time, but I think the future can only bring good things, be it in politics, be it in games, and hopefully we will see things like that eventually, because I can't see how that would be a bad thing. Just even the idea, even if the game somehow turns out to be awful, but I think it would be an important precedent, you know? Any other comments or questions before you?
I was wondering, if you talk about politics, there's a lot of like misinformation sometimes in politics.
Absolutely, yeah.
Are there any good examples of games where you have to like deal with misinformation and try to figure out what's going on, like in more of a political way?
Final Fantasy X obviously comes to mind, and it kind of forces your hand on that, because it wants you to see it a certain way, but you can't interpret it subtly, especially if you think about it in terms of the people. Like, the people wanted to come to believe the manipulations because it gave them hope. And they kind of backhand that in Uleska's speech, for instance, but I don't think, you can view that as being very patronizing, but I still view it as it's what she came to because she ultimately believed in Spira and loving Spira, even though she might have known and believed keeping the legend of her father, Yevon, alive, and, it could be interpreted either way. But I think there's opportunities for that. And I'm sure there's tons of other ones, but again, use the popular examples.
I'm going to have to jet in a few minutes, so I'd love to rapid fire these, but I would just go back to papers, please.
Oh, Tim, may I go to 6? Sorry, I didn't, because there's nothing here till 6, and I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, sure.
I can probably stick around to 5:45.
Gotcha. Let's see who else over here.
Quick question. Is there another shooter that does a good job answering the question of, like, who we shoot at? That doesn't take a simple answer, but makes it more interesting. Because, like, Spec Ops, that's a good go-to answer. What's the other one besides Spec Ops that has a really good answer to who do we shoot at?
The only other ones I can think of are really obscure, and they have really terrible answers, but make it very clear through those terrible answers.
Okay. Since we only have 7 or so minutes left, I just wanted to, as I intended, I wanted to, and I'm glad that everyone wanted to offer, opinions. Do it again next year, but just to tie it into the vaunted ethics quickly. It was covering Solid Snake's point. I thought it was a good way to jump into when it comes. Granted, we were talking about it in terms of Christian versus non-Christian scoring, but I thought that was a good way to talk about the fundamental nature, be it from a conservative perspective, of how games are scored. And when in doubt, you don't have to explain it stuff. You go to someone who can explain it for you, preferably someone who's popular. So I use this.
These days, since the internet is almost diametrically opposed to the notion of quality control, in recent years it's been a lot easier to just assume everything's shit until it can prove itself otherwise. I like to call it the Guantanamo Bay approach to reviewing, but as for why I review stuff by popular demand regardless of personal, it's partly because it feels more professional than constant self-indulgence, but mostly because I use my traffic figures to measure my worth as a human being. I like the idea of a professional troll, that makes me think of a hideous creature under a bridge handing out business cards. This is a review here. From a purely objective standpoint, SSBB is actually quite a superb game, as you can tell by reading reviews. I think you should look at the word objective, because I don't think it means what you think it means. It's worth remembering that all reviews are subjective personal opinions, and if you personally enjoy the game, then they really shouldn't get to you. Unless, of course, there's a despicable little niggling doubt in the back of your mind that maybe you're not having as much fun as you've convinced yourself you're having, which doesn't go away no matter how many times you try to slap it down with the wet flannel of weak excuses like this one. I'm not a fan.
And I actually realized I just forgot to do it earlier, but when he talks about the specificity of number scores, because I once worked for a site that we kind of took a stand on that, and we weren't doing it, and then eventually I think it was because of Metacritic, we had to, and I found it very difficult. At one point where one of my exes pointed out, it's like, this review, you gave it a 5, but it reads like a 7, and I just wanted her off my back, so I changed it, and just the entire thing. But in his context, he goes like, I don't believe complex opinions can be boiled down to it. It's like, you want to score? Okay, 4, as in fork you, and it's just, again, go on and on, but that's the real ethics in gaming journalism, like how we, not how it's been co-opted, but how we, as he's trying to say, boil it down, complex opinions, what it means to be subjective, and just enjoy what you can, because there's so many cases. The one I played most recently, Unlimited Saga, trashed to hell by nearly everyone, but it is probably the most realistic interpretation that is probably possible of a paper and pencil RPG. It's an homage in almost every way to Dungeons and Dragons, and I urge everyone to check it out, despite I think it got like 23 or something on Metascore. Almost everybody hated it, because I don't think they played it for more than 20 minutes.
Should we just rapid fire like 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Maybe I saw 1 or 2 more. Anybody got anything else? 1, yes, go.
Does Civilization have any strong implications for anything?
I think Civilization shows you Gandhi was actually playing the nuke assault. No, Civilization is great. Can teach you a lot. Can teach you about everything from getting you interested in those characters to sort of the developmental paths of society, or at least get you to think about them. I go into this one for 15 minutes, but I'm going to cut myself off over there. You get this one.
What are the bad ramifications you guys were talking about with the Assassin's Creed thing, how they put this big context of, we have all these viewpoints, so this is not actually what we representative of. How do we deal with that? And the thing that comes to mind is, Modern Warfare, no Russian, the fact that you can skip it, and then therefore, in my mind, it has no meaning and is there for shock value. How do we reconcile doing something political versus shock value?
First time I saw that, Modern Warfare 2, 2009, I first saw the trailer and like almost all the comments immediately got political. And I said, and I don't know how many people responded or upvoted or like Yahtzee was making fun of their worth as a human being by your traffic, but I thought it was a good point to make, like, the possibility is cool, and I was viewing it mostly from a mainstream thing, like, well, we can point to this when anybody claims about violence in video games, and of course they'll frame the story only as, oh, you kill everybody in the airport, not the part where you don't have to, and even the inherent nature of the character who you're playing. And that's what fascinated me about it, because you don't have to kill anybody because you don't want to break your cover, but look what it ultimately ends up resulting in anyway.
You actually can't get through that level without killing people. No.
You have to kill the SWAT officers.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, see, I haven't played the
I was
game, I've just
talking
seen
more
the
about
video.
the fact that literally you can skip that level and not
Right.
even have it
Oh, that's,
show.
yeah, I think that's
And I
what
think
it is.
that's bad. And I think that's someone trying to hide something or just doing something to show.
I was probably hoping a little too much that it would, you know,
Yeah.
elevate the conversation rather than just trolling comments. But just to finish it up, I do appreciate everybody, and I hope we can do it again next year. But if you take one thing away from this panel, I hope it will be this. And this not only refers to politics, but nerd culture in general. Because when you fundamentally think about it, this is true.
Maybe you're the kind of person who remembers which bush to burn in The Legend of Zelda to find the labyrinth, or maybe you're the kind of person who remembers the score to some sports game years ago. Maybe you like to go around in a Star Trek uniform, or you like to go around in a sports uniform. I don't mean like a sports t-shirt, but the same jersey that the players in the game wear. Whatever the case, maybe, somehow, in our own ways, we're all nerds.
It's amazing how a nerd can be co-opted simply because something is popular. But when you break it down, it is extremely nerdy, so many aspects of sports and football. But boy, will they get pissed off if you try and point that out. You know?
There's just one last thing I really wanted to say, because I mean, this being a politics panel, it's something that I've encountered with our culture a great deal, and I just wanted to stress to all of you guys that we talk about all these issues. Many of you are clearly passionate about these issues. If you haven't, go register to vote. We all talk about, oh my God, this democracy is so big, it's so broken. No, our democracy actually does still work. So please, I run into people all the time who come up to these conventions and say, my vote, my voice doesn't matter. Just, if you haven't, I mean, many of you are old enough, please go register to vote.
Absolutely. It certainly can be made easier since you don't